For those who have paid attention to the history of the modern Middle East, the name Saddam Hussein, former president of Iraq, is certainly not unfamiliar. He was overthrown after a controversial war initiated by the United States in 2003. So, what were the notable milestones in Saddam Hussein's life? What significant events occurred in Iraq during his more than 20 years of rule? Let's explore through the biography of Saddam Hussein by author PHMNG, published on the Spiro website. This is a translation by the author based on Russian language materials, edited and supplemented by the Spider Room team. Let's go through the content of the article. According to official Iraqi documents, Saddam Hussein was born on April 28, 1937, into a poor peasant family in the village of Al-Orja, in the district of Tikrit. His father, Hussein, died before Saddam was born, so he was adopted by his uncle Ibrahim al-Hassan. According to local customs, Ibrahim married his deceased brother's widow, so he became both Saddam's uncle and stepfather. Due to being harshly treated by his stepfather, in 1947 Saddam fled from his rural village to the district administrative center, the city of Tikrit, for an opportunity to study. He lived with his maternal uncle, Khairallah Tulfa, who had once been an officer in the Royal Iraqi Army and later served under Prime Minister Rashid Ali al-Gilani. In 1954, Saddam moved to Baghdad to study at Al-Qahr Secondary School. In 1957, at the age of 20, Saddam Hussein became a member of the Iraqi branch of the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, also known as the Ba'ath Party. This party was founded in Damascus in the early 1940s by two Syrian teachers, Michel Aflaq and Salah al-Din al-Baita. The party's ideological basis declared goals of unity, liberation, and socialism. A year later, Saddam married his cousin Sajida, the daughter of Khairallah Tulfa, the man who had supported Saddam for many years when he first came to Tikrit. On October 6, 1959, Saddam participated in a failed assassination attempt targeting the then Iraqi Prime Minister Abd al-Karim Qasim. Although severely wounded, Saddam managed to escape and return home. He later fled to Syria due to ideological conflicts between the Ba'ath Party and Qasim's communist government. After arriving in Syria, at the beginning of 1960 Saddam moved to Cairo, Egypt, to study for a year at the Egyptian School of Law. He then enrolled in the law faculty at Cairo University and continued his studies there for 2 years. During his time in Cairo, Saddam rose from being a regular party member to becoming a prominent Ba'athist figure, eventually joining the leadership committee of the Ba'ath Party in Egypt. On February 8, 1963, a coup occurred in Iraq, allowing the Ba'ath Party to take power in Baghdad. Saddam returned to Iraq to assume a leadership position under the socialist faction of the Ba'ath Party. In October of the same year, at the 6th National Congress of the Ba'ath Party in Damascus, Saddam Hussein delivered a strong speech, sharply criticizing the actions of Ali Saleh al-Sadi, the Secretary-General of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq since 1960. It took great courage to confront such a powerful man in Iraq, so upon returning to Baghdad, Saddam had to avoid arrest. On November 11, 1963, at the recommendation of the National Ba'ath Congress, the Regional Congress of the Iraqi Ba'ath Party removed al-Sadi from his post as Secretary-General, holding him accountable for the crimes committed during the party's rule. Saddam's performance at the Ba'ath National Congress left a strong impression on Michel Aflaq, the founder and Secretary-General of the Ba'ath Party. Around this time, the two established a strong bond. On November 18, 1963, the Iraqi army under the leadership of Abdul Salam Arif launched a coup and overthrew the Ba'ath government. While in custody, Saddam began organizing party members to re-establish the Ba'ath Party. By February 1964, the leadership of the Arab Ba'ath Party decided to form a new Iraqi Ba'ath leadership composed of 5 members, including General Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, a famous figure in Iraq, and Saddam Hussein. Both al-Bakr and Saddam Hussein were from Tikrit, from the same tribe, and Saddam's cousin was married to al-Bakr's daughter. However, after 2 unsuccessful attempts to regain power in Baghdad, Saddam was arrested and placed in solitary confinement. It wasn't until July 1966 that Saddam and other Ba'ath Party members successfully escaped from prison thanks to a plan by al-Bakr. 2 months later, during an emergency regional congress held under strict secrecy, Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr was elected party secretary, and Saddam Hussein became his deputy. Saddam was then assigned to lead a special Ba'ath unit codenamed Jihaz Hanan. It was a secret apparatus composed of the most loyal personnel, responsible for internal management and rooting out traitors. In June 1967, after the Arab-Israeli War, Iraq severed diplomatic ties with the United States due to its pro-Israel stance. On July 17, 1968, the Ba'ath Party successfully staged a coup, ousting Arif. Supreme power was transferred to the Revolutionary Command Council, RCC, led by al-Bakr, who also became president and commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Saddam Hussein, as deputy secretary of the party, became vice-chairman of the RCC, in charge of internal security. At that time, the Iraqi Communist Party was split into 2 factions. The Central Command, led by Aziz ul-Hajj, launched a covert guerrilla struggle against the Ba'ath Party. Meanwhile, the Central Committee faction was in a fragile ceasefire with the Ba'athists. On April 19, 1969, Iran unilaterally rejected the 1937 treaty, which defined the border along the Shatt al-Arab waterway between Iraq and Iran. As a result, any ship passing from the Persian Gulf to one of Iran's ports along this waterway would now be in disputed territory with Iraq. Normally, river boundaries between 2 countries lie at the midpoint of the river, but this treaty placed the border on Iran's side, effectively putting the entire river under Iraqi control. Iran suffered the disadvantage. On January 21, 1970, Baghdad accused the Iranian embassy in Iraq of subversive activities. In response, the Iraqi ambassador was ordered to leave Tehran within 24 hours. It wasn't until 1973 that diplomatic relations between the 2 countries were restored. In July 1970, at Saddam Hussein's suggestion, the Ba'ath Party and the Iraqi Communist Party issued several conditions for possible cooperation. If accepted, the conditions would allow the Communist Party's Central Committee to join the National Progressive Front, NPF. Some of the conditions included recognizing the historical and progressive role of the July 17, 1968 revolution and acknowledging the Ba'ath Party's leadership in the government, mass organizations, and the front. This part requires understanding that the Ba'ath Party established a front called the National Progressive Front, NPF, which allowed other non-Ba'athist parties with socialist ideologies, such as the Communist Party, to join and participate in politics, provided they accepted Ba'athist leadership. This system was actually invented by Hafez al-Assad in Syria after his own coup in 1970. Saddam Hussein only began learning after July 16, 1970, when a temporary constitution was issued, declaring Iraq a sovereign People's Democratic Republic. The highest authority was the Revolutionary Command Council, RCC, chaired by the President of the Republic. Later, from July 1979, Saddam Hussein became both President and Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. From May 1994, Saddam also served as Prime Minister. Around mid-1970, relations between Iraq and Syria were frozen. The reason was the construction of the El Fez Dam in Syria, which led to water shortages in Iraq and famine affecting more than 3 million farmers, according to Iraq. In reality, the ideological differences between the 2 Ba'athist parties in Iraq and Syria were the actual cause of tensions between the 2 countries. In July 1973, the Central Committee of the Iraqi Communist Party accepted the terms of the Ba'ath's National Action Charter, CNA, which had been signed by President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr as General Secretary of the Ba'ath Party and Aziz Mohammed as First Secretary of the Central Committee of the Iraqi Communist Party. However, the Kurdish Democratic Party, KDP, refused the proposal to join the National Progressive Front. Yet, a law on Kurdish autonomy passed by the KDP caused division within the Kurdish nationalist movement. A new KDP party split off from the original KDP. This party, along with other Kurdish political forces, began cooperating with the government in establishing the autonomous administration of Kurdistan under their own conditions. On October 7, 1973, one day after the start of the Fourth Arab-Israeli War, Iraq decided to restore diplomatic relations with Iran. But by March 1974, Iran opened its borders to Kurdish rebels retreating from Iraq under pressure from government forces. Military camps were established in Iran to train Kurdish fighters. Also in that year, the autonomous Kurdish region of Kar was established in northern Iraq, centered in the city of Bibi. Between 1975 and 1978, around 300,000 to 350,000 Kurds were expelled from Iraq, and 250 Kurdish villages were burned. On March 6, 1975, through mediation by Algerian President Houari Boumediene, Iran and Iraq signed an agreement during the OPEC summit. Most importantly, the two countries signed a new border agreement in the Shatt al-Arab region. The 1937 treaty was annulled, and the border was redrawn along the middle of the river. In return, Iran committed to stopping support for Kurdish insurgents in Iraq. On April 3, 196, likely 1976, Saddam Hussein's two main political rivals, General Hardin and Interior Minister Soleimani Amash, were appointed as vice presidents of Iraq. Shortly afterward, while abroad on a business trip, Hardin received a surprise notice that he had been dismissed from all positions and was instead appointed ambassador, an offer he refused. A few months later, Hardin was assassinated in Kuwait by unknown assailants, and his body was never found. Amash, in September of the same year, was also removed from all positions and appointed ambassador to Finland. These were clear moves by Saddam Hussein to consolidate and monopolize power. By 1977, the provincial Ba'ath Party organizations, intelligence services, military commands, and ministers were all reporting directly to Saddam. In May 1978, 31 communists and others accused of helping them set up party cells in the army were executed. Hussein declared communists to be foreign agents and traitors to Iraq. After that, he arrested nearly all representatives of the Iraqi Communist Party in the National Progressive Front and banned all related publications. From that point onward, the Iraqi Communist Party was forced to go underground. On July 17, 1979, Iraqi President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr resigned from all positions. The official reason given was ill health, and Saddam Hussein succeeded him. In a massive purge campaign that followed, many people were executed, including one-third of the members of the Revolutionary Command Council, ministers, regional Ba'ath leadership members, trade union leaders, and others who had been appointed by the former President al-Bakr. This marked the point when Saddam Hussein officially became the supreme leader of Iraq. Only 2 months after taking power, Saddam unilaterally declared Iraq's rejection of the 1975 Algiers Agreement concerning the Shatt al-Arab border with Iran. Also in 1979, Iran's Islamic government, led by Khomeini, demanded that Iraq transfer Shia holy shrines located in Karbala and Najaf, within Iraqi territory, to the Iranian city of Qom. Baghdad responded extremely harshly. On October 7 that year, the Iraqi consulate in Khorramshahr, Iran, was attacked. The Iranian government officially renamed the Persian Gulf to the Islamic Gulf. Secret Shia organizations began to be formed in Iraq. In 1980, Iran and Iraq's border tensions escalated. On August 8, 1980, Saddam Hussein ordered the execution of Grand Ayatollah Mohammad Baqir al-Sadr, the leading Shia cleric in Iraq, and his sister. After that, Iraq bombed the Iranian city of Qazvin-e-Sherri, a major migration center for Iraqi Shia. In 1980, Iraq called on the United Nations Security Council to demand that Iran immediately return the islands of Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, and Lesser Tunb in the Strait of Hormuz, which had been annexed in 1971. In response, Iran called on Iraqis to overthrow Saddam Hussein's regime and labeled him an enemy of the Quran and Islam. In July of that year, at a press conference for foreign journalists, Iraq declared it would not sit idle in the face of Iran's aggression. By early September, the border conflict between the two nations intensified, involving heavy artillery, aircraft, and warships. On September 9, 1980, Iraqi troops pushed Iranian forces out of the Zayn al-Khorz area. By September 16, Iraq claimed to have liberated 125 square miles of territory it considered its own. In response, Iran closed its airspace to Iraq and banned all movements through the Shatt al-Arab and the Strait of Hormuz. On September 17, at an emergency meeting of Iraq's National Council, Saddam Hussein declared that the Shatt al-Arab should belong to the Arab world and Iraq. 4 days later, Iran ordered all merchant ships to leave the Shatt al-Arab. Then on September 22, Iraq launched a large-scale war against Iran, aiming to capture the oil-rich province of Khuzestan and establish full control over the Shatt al-Arab waterway. This action starkly contradicted what Saddam Hussein had told Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin just days earlier, that Iraq would not conduct any major military operations against Iran in the near future. On September 27, 1980, the Iraqi army captured Al-Waz. But by early October, due to fierce fighting near Abadan, the Iraqi advance was halted, and Saddam Hussein's plan for a quick end to the war during the Eid al-Adha holiday on October 20 collapsed. By November, Iraq had taken control of Khorramshahr. Along over 350 kilometers of the border, the Iraqi army had advanced 10 to 40 kilometers into Iran. By early January 1981, Iran launched a major counteroffensive with tanks in the battlefield area. After a fierce battle, Iran suffered a setback, losing 140 tanks while Iraq lost 50. From February to early March 1981, a delegation of Islamic goodwill, including the presidents of Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Gambia, along with Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, visited Baghdad and Tehran one after another but failed to reconcile the two countries. In May of that year, Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor, built with French assistance, was destroyed by an Israeli airstrike. During this period, Iranian bombers freely flew over Iraqi territory, bombing the country's military bases near the Syrian border. Subsequently, Iran successfully carried out several counterattacks in July and August, causing significant damage to Iraq. By September, Iran launched a counterattack in the south, and Iranian artillery shelled Basra, Iraq's critically important port city. By 1982, from March to May, Iranian forces gradually pushed back Iraq in operations such as Fath al-Mobin and Beit al-Maqdis. As a result, Iraqi forces had to retreat, and the border between the two countries nearly reverted to its pre-war status. The Iranian president even calculated the cost of the war, estimating that Iraq should pay reparations amounting to approximately $150 billion, later reduced to $135 billion, but eventually rising to $163 billion. Also in May 1982, Iraq suffered another blow when Syria shut down the pipeline to the Mediterranean Sea, significantly reducing Iraq's oil exports. In response, Iraq announced the official blockade of Iran's oil port, warning that any vessels in the area would be sunk without warning. In retaliation, Iran also declared that any foreign ships approaching Iraq would be attacked. As the military situation increasingly worsened for Iraq, on June 10, 1982, Iraq issued a statement expressing willingness to cease fire and withdraw its troops within 2 weeks. However, no negotiations took place until July 13, when Iran launched an attack on the city of Basra. The assault yielded no results and caused significant Iranian losses. Fighting continued into July 1983, when Iran launched an offensive in the north with support from Kurdish forces, though it was not particularly successful. In October of that year, Iran captured 400 square kilometers in the Penjwin area in northern Iraq. In retaliation, Iraq launched missile attacks on Iran's southern border towns. In February 1984, a frenzied battle occurred over small islands in the marshes near the city of Al-Qurna, involving up to 500,000 troops on both sides. According to Iran, Iraq used chemical weapons during the battle. By May, Iran began its war against oil tankers in the Persian Gulf, launching airstrikes on 2 Kuwaiti tankers. By mid-1986, over 200 ships from various countries had been damaged. The tanker war did not favor Iran. They damaged 25 Iraqi tankers, while Iraq damaged 65 Iranian ones. Citing violations of maritime freedom, the U.S. Navy, including the aircraft carrier USS Midway, was deployed to the area. Subsequently, 2 Iranian aircraft were shot down on June 12, 1984. Through UN mediation, Iran and Iraq reached a temporary agreement to halt attacks on civilian targets, but this agreement was violated in March 1985, and the war persisted. In 1984, Iran breached Iraq's northern defensive lines near Basra and held a bridgehead in the Hafizeh marshes. By March 1985, Iranian cruise missiles struck Baghdad and other densely populated Iraqi areas. In response, Iraq launched heavy bombing campaigns on Iranian cities. In September, Iran launched a new offensive on the Mainoun Island area, penetrating deep into Iraqi territory and threatening to isolate Basra. Iranian forces began advancing toward Basra in February 1986 but ultimately failed and had to retreat. Both sides suffered heavy casualties in this campaign, but the siege on Basra was lifted. The war front lines entered a state of stalemate, although shelling of cities and tanker attacks continued. In mid-December 1986, Iran again attacked southern areas near Basra. Although they crossed the Shatt al-Arab River, they encountered fierce resistance and had to withdraw. Unrelenting, Iran launched another assault in January 1987, but by late February, Iranian forces were stopped over 10 kilometers from Basra. In retaliation for Iranian attacks, Saddam Hussein ordered bombings of the cities of Tehran and Isfahan. In March 1987, Iran launched an offensive in Kurdish areas of Iraq with support from local Kurdish forces. Iran attacked Suleimania but was halted at the city's outskirts. By May that year, reports emerged that Saddam Hussein had secretly met Syrian President Hafez al-Assad in Damascus through the mediation of the King of Jordan. Syria's efforts were not in vain, as Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait agreed to a 6-month suspension of attacks on ships starting January 1988. The reconciliation efforts also helped prevent a major Iranian offensive planned for February of the same year. Around late 1987, UN Secretary-General Javier Pérez de Cuellar visited both Baghdad and Tehran. Following the visit, Iraq agreed to end hostilities on the condition that Iran withdrew from its territory and that an international committee be formed to investigate the cause of the war. Iran also expressed readiness to end the war but only if Iraq were recognized as the aggressor. Eventually, a resolution was drafted under which UN special representatives would conduct consultations with the warring parties and determine the date to commence a ceasefire. By late May 1988, Iran and Iraq pledged not to cross each other's national borders or occupy one another's territory during the liberation of disputed areas. Thanks to this agreement, Iraqi forces were able to recapture territory in the Mainoun and Penguin areas as well as elsewhere. Subsequently, on July 14, 1988, a meeting of high-ranking religious, political, and military leaders was held in Tehran, where all parties agreed to accept the UN peace plan under Resolution 598. On July 17, Khomeini sent a letter to the UN Security Council officially announcing acceptance of the peace plan. On the same day, Saddam Hussein announced a plan to end the conflict, including a ceasefire, troop withdrawal, prisoner exchange, signing of a peace treaty, a non-aggression pact, and an agreement not to interfere in each other's internal affairs while maintaining regional security. However, before the ceasefire agreement was implemented, Iran and Iraq continued military actions on the battlefield. On July 28, Iraqi forces launched simultaneous attacks along southern fronts. Avaz was threatened, and the Iraqi army captured the cities of Islamabad, Mehran, and Kerbala at the cost of considerable casualties. Iran managed to repel the attacks. Finally, on August 8, the UN Security Council, the Soviet Union announced that the official ceasefire agreement would take effect at 3 a.m. on August 20. Khomeini later also abandoned the slogan of war to win victory and agreed to a truce with Iraq. The Iran-Iraq War thus came to an end, becoming the longest regional war of the 20th century and resulting in significant casualties, with the number of deaths estimated to range from about 0.5 to 1 million people. Due to this war, Iraq had to bear a huge foreign debt, with estimates ranging from $60 to $80 billion. After the war ended, in February 1989, Iraq and Egypt merged into the Arab Cooperation Council, ACC, an organization established to counter the growing influence of Saudi Arabia. In May 1990, at the Arab Summit in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein called for the formation of a united front against Western aggression. However, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak did not share this appeal, stating that the Arab mission must be humane, logical, and realistic, without exaggerating roles or threatening. The prospect of closer ties between Egypt and Iraq then became meaningless. In April 1990, a delegation of U.S. senators visited Baghdad. In a meeting with Saddam, they assured him that the Baghdad regime was highly valued by Washington. On July 25, Saddam Hussein had a one-hour conversation with the U.S. ambassador, April Glaspie. Much has been written about this conversation, which occurred the night before Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. The Iraqi side released a recording in which the U.S. ambassador allegedly said that the U.S. would consider Iraq's actions regarding its territorial dispute with Kuwait as an internal Arab matter. The Americans claimed the recording was incomplete but did not deny the truth of what Glaspie said. Everything began on July 18, 1990, when Iraq accused Kuwait of stealing oil from the southern Rumaila border since 1980. As compensation, Baghdad demanded Kuwait pay $2.4 billion and forgive $10 billion in loans Iraq owed Kuwait. Iraq then demanded Kuwait lease the islands of Bubiyan and Warbar at the mouth of the Shatt al-Arab River. Kuwait denied the accusations and refused to make concessions or payments. Several Arab nations tried to mediate the conflict, but to no avail. On July 21, Iraq accused Kuwait of pro-American policies and participating in a conspiracy against Arab nations. Finally, on August 2, Iraq launched a military invasion of Kuwait at the request of the puppet government of the Free Kuwait Provisional Government created by Iraq. The United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 660 demanding the immediate withdrawal of Iraqi troops. The Soviet Union's foreign ministry announced the suspension of military supplies to Iraq. Simultaneously, the U.S. froze Iraqi bank assets. For days later, the UN Security Council imposed wide-ranging economic sanctions on Iraq. On August 8, Iraq announced the annexation of Kuwait, forming a federal state. Around 300,000 Palestinian immigrants were granted citizenship by the Democratic Republic of Kuwait. The U.S. president decided to send troops to Saudi Arabia. 2 days later, an emergency summit of Arab leaders was held in Cairo, strongly condemning Iraq's invasion of Kuwait and demanding an immediate Iraqi withdrawal. 12 countries voted in favor, 3 opposed: Iraq, Libya, and Palestine. Algeria and Yemen abstained, and 3 others, Jordan, Sudan, and Mauritania, supported the resolution with further discussion. Some Arab countries like Egypt, Syria, and Morocco decided to send troops to Saudi Arabia to protect it from possible invasion, forming a counterbalance against Iraq. The Cairo-Riyadh-Damascus axis was established. On August 11, NATO and the European Common Market, predecessor of the EU, held separate foreign ministers' meetings in Brussels. The NATO Secretary-General stated that a collective NATO action against Iraq was ruled out because the Gulf was not within NATO's area of operations. By August 14, Baghdad proposed peace to Iran and announced it would begin withdrawing from Iranian territories occupied by Iraq after the 8-year war ended. Iraq also declared it was ready to exchange prisoners of war and adhere to the 1975 border law regarding the Shatt al-Arab River. In response, Iran agreed to turn the current ceasefire into a long-term and stable peace. A few days later, Baghdad declared it would deploy citizens of hostile countries at strategic points as human shields against potential attacks. Amid these complex developments, on August 24, Soviet Communist Party General Secretary Gorbachev sent a personal message to Saddam Hussein urging him to comply with UN demands, otherwise, the UN Security Council would be forced to take appropriate additional measures. The next day, Baghdad and Tehran restored diplomatic relations. The UN Security Council authorized the use of force against Iraq. That same day, Iraq declared Kuwait a province of its own. This move led to a meeting between US President Bush and Soviet General Secretary Gorbachev on September 9, during which both declared a unified stance against Iraq's aggression. The U.S. went further when President Bush stated before Congress that the U.S. would never compromise or accept Iraq's invasion and occupation of Kuwait. On September 25, 1990, the UN Security Council extended its blockade against Iraq to include airspace. By September 27, a total of 25 countries had sent troops to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. the US began direct intervention, and by October 17, about 200,000 American troops were stationed in the Gulf. By October 29, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 674 to end Iraq's aggression against Kuwait. On November 8, President Bush announced the deployment of an additional 200,000 troops to the Gulf, raising the total US troop presence to 700,000. A week later, during a meeting with Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz, Gorbachev once again insisted that the Soviet Union demanded Iraq's immediate withdrawal. On November 29, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 678, issuing an ultimatum for Iraq to withdraw completely from Kuwait before January 15, 1991. It also authorized the use of all necessary measures to force Iraq's withdrawal. Baghdad immediately rejected the UN ultimatum. On December 22, President Bush announced that if Iraq did not withdraw from Kuwait by January 15, military force would be used against it. Iraq declared it would not leave Kuwait and would use chemical weapons if attacked. 2 days later, Iraq further declared that if a military attack occurred, it would strike Israel. During a meeting between the foreign ministers of both countries, Iraq and the United States met in Geneva on November 8, 1991. The US warned that if Iraq used weapons of mass destruction, it would pay a very heavy price for it. 4 days later, the US Congress passed a resolution allowing the use of force against Iraq. UN Secretary-General Perez de Cuellar later failed to convince Saddam Hussein to withdraw troops from Kuwait. On January 15, the deadline of the ultimatum issued by the UN Security Council, Saddam Hussein declared that he would win the war even against the entire coalition against Iraq. On the night of January 17 and early morning of January 18, 1991, an airstrike was launched targeting sites in Iraq and Kuwait as part of Operation Desert Storm. By early morning, Iraq launched retaliatory missile attacks on the suburbs of Tel Aviv, Haifa, and some other settlements in Israel. On January 19, Iraq initiated an environmental war in the Gulf region by opening valves at oil terminals on an artificial island in the port of Al-Amadi. The disaster was prevented thanks to an airstrike on the oil pipeline. A few days later, the Iraqis brought some supertankers to the coast of Kuwait to dump their cargo into the sea. By January 21, Iraq began systematically blowing up oil tanks and wells in Kuwait. A total of about 1,000 wells were damaged, 727 were set on fire, and others spilled. On February 11, 1991, Iraq launched its 13th missile attack on Israel, injuring many people. 2 days later, U.S. Air Force planes bombed a bomb shelter in the Ameria area of Baghdad, killing more than 400 civilians. Since the beginning of Operation Desert Storm, coalition air forces had conducted 65,000 sorties. On the night of February 21 and early morning of February 22, 1991, Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz met directly with Soviet Foreign Minister Gorbachev in Moscow. Gorbachev proposed to formalize the dialogue results in the form of 7 points. Iran would declare complete and unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait. The withdrawal would begin the day after the ceasefire and be conducted over a fixed period. After 2/3 of Iraqi troops withdrew from Kuwait, economic sanctions on Iraq would be lifted. The complete withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait would eliminate the need for further Security Council resolutions. The withdrawal would be monitored by observers from countries not involved in the conflict. The next day, Aziz spoke at the press center of the Soviet Foreign Ministry and declared that the Iraqi government fully supported the plan and political solution for the Gulf that had been achieved in the Moscow talks. He also stated that Iraq agreed to implement Resolution 660 and withdraw all forces from Kuwait. The withdrawal would begin the day after the ceasefire and continue for 21 days. After completion, the basis for the remaining UN Security Council resolutions on Iraq would expire. All prisoners of war would be released and repatriated within 3 days of the ceasefire. The ceasefire and withdrawal would be monitored by observers or peacekeeping forces as decided by the UN Security Council. In the early morning of February 24, US President Bush declared that he had ordered the start of ground operations against Iraq. 11 countries in the anti-Iraq coalition participated in the attack. By the morning of February 26, coalition forces on the coastal front had advanced more than 50 kilometers and began attacking Kuwait's capital. On the night of February 25 and early morning of February 26, Saddam Hussein's order for Iraqi troops to withdraw from Kuwait was broadcast on Baghdad radio. By this time, Iraqi losses were relatively heavy. On the night of February 27 and early morning of February 28, the U.S. president declared the end of hostilities in the Gulf after Iraq agreed to implement all 12 UN Security Council resolutions regarding Kuwait. Subsequently, the U.S. also accepted UN Security Council Resolution 686, which required Iraq to compensate Kuwait and other warring nations. In early March 1991, insurgent forces in southern Iraq captured Basra and 5 other cities. Kurdish rebels in Iraq seized the main city of the region, Sulaymaniyah. Meanwhile, fierce clashes erupted in many other cities between government forces and rebels. By March 9, Kurdish rebels had seized the city of Erbil. However, in the south, government forces managed to regain the upper hand. On March 12, parties and organizations opposing Saddam Hussein's government held a meeting in Beirut. The goal of the meeting was to ensure support for the popular uprising in Iraq. The Kurdish rebels took control of the Kirkuk region, and the city of Kirkuk itself was surrounded by rebel forces. On March 24, the UN Security Council eased some economic sanctions on Iraq. By April 3, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 687, which required the destruction of Iraq's chemical and biological weapon stockpiles and missiles, established international control over nuclear facilities, and deployed UN observers to the buffer zone between Iraq and Kuwait. On the same day, Iraqi forces recaptured Sulaymaniyah, and by April 4, Iraq declared that the northern uprising had been suppressed. About 2 to 3 million Kurds had to flee to the northern mountains and the border with Turkey. On April 6, the UN condemned Iraq's repression of the Kurds and demanded that the Iraqi government allow international humanitarian organizations access to the country through a corresponding resolution. US, French, and British forces participated in a campaign to ensure safety and provide refugee camps for the fleeing Kurds. In April, after the failed uprising, the National Front of the Kurds in Iraq held negotiations with Saddam Hussein's government. However, the Kurds' demands were rejected by Baghdad. Iraq then began implementing economic and administrative blockades against the Kurds. By October, under pressure from the UN, Saddam Hussein agreed to withdraw troops from the Kurdish region in Iraq, including the 3 provinces of Erbil, Sulaymaniyah, and Doak. 5 years later, on September 9, 1996, in a lightning attack, Iraqi forces captured Erbil and destroyed the headquarters of the Iraqi National Congress, a Kurdish organization founded and funded by the CIA. In response, the US launched missile strikes against Iraq and expanded the no-fly zone for Iraqi aircraft. On December 17, 1998, the US and the UK launched a joint airstrike on Iraq called Operation Desert Fox. The operation aimed to address the crisis surrounding the inspection of Iraq's military facilities by international disarmament experts. The operation involved 300 aircraft, 40 ships, and more than 30,000 soldiers. It lasted 72 hours, during which 6,590 sorties were flown and 415 cruise missiles were launched, hitting 74 out of 100 military targets. Germany supported the action, while France, Russia, and China opposed it. The UN Secretary-General later condemned the bombing of Iraq, also in 1998. Saddam Hussein's relationship with the international community. In a speech on September 12, 2002, before the United Nations Security Council, the U.S. Congress passed the Iraq Resolution in October 2002, allowing the president to use all necessary measures against Iraq. Most Americans believed that Saddam possessed weapons of mass destruction. By February 2003, 64% of Americans supported launching a military campaign to overthrow Saddam Hussein. On the 5th of February 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell gave a speech before the United Nations Security Council, presenting a vial containing white powder. The U.S. claimed this was proof that the Iraqi government was hiding weapons of mass destruction. However, most of the information Powell presented was based on statements by Rafid Ahmed Alwan al-Janabi, codenamed Curveball, an Iraqi exile living in Germany at the time. Curveball claimed that he had been a chemical engineer working at a secret Iraqi weapons factory for weapons of mass destruction. The CIA used Curveball's testimony as the foundation to accuse Saddam's regime of not abandoning its WMD program. However, Janabi's story was later confirmed by a U.S. government investigative team on Iraq to be inaccurate. In 2015, UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, in an interview with CNN, also admitted that the reports about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq were false. Yet, he expressed no regret over toppling Saddam, which led many to believe that the Iraq War in 2003 was actually a war for oil, in which the US and the UK aimed to install a pro-Western government to open the country's rich oil resources to their companies. Even though no weapons of mass destruction were found, no one in the US or UK was held accountable or punished for the false and baseless information. But by 2003, the US had enough of an excuse to launch a war against Iraq. In March of that year, the US and many allies, including the UK, Poland, Australia, Spain, Denmark, and Italy, began preparing military operations against Iraq. Meanwhile, countries like France, Germany, Canada, and Russia voiced their opposition and called for a diplomatic solution, but were unsuccessful. On March 20, US and Allied forces officially launched attacks on Iraq. Completely outmatched, the Iraqi government and army collapsed within 3 weeks. By early April, US-led forces had taken most of Iraq's territory. On April 9, the US military captured the capital, Baghdad. However, Saddam Hussein vanished in the following weeks. Even after major fighting had ended, the US and its allies could not locate Saddam Hussein. Finally, on December 13, 2003, during Operation Red Dawn, Saddam Hussein was captured by US forces after being found hiding in an underground hole at a farm near Ad-Dor, close to Tikrit. On December 14, US officials confirmed that Saddam Hussein had indeed been captured. On June 30, 2004, Saddam Hussein and 11 other senior Ba'ath Party leaders were handed over by the US to Iraq's interim government to stand trial. The trial of Saddam Hussein lasted for years, and on 0/11/2006, unclear date, he was convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death by hanging. He was executed on December 30, 2006, despite his wish to be executed by firing squad, which he claimed was the legitimate military execution for someone who was the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The execution was carried out at Camp Justice, a military base in Qudhimiyah, a northeastern suburb of Baghdad. Saddam Hussein was buried the next day in his hometown, the village of Al-Orja near Tikrit. That concludes the full content of this article. Through it, you now have a more comprehensive understanding of Saddam Hussein's life and the key events in Iraq during his rule. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to History Around YouTube channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss future content. For now, goodbye and farewell. CYA